G'day mate, 40 here. So remember Trump's shooting and the fat female Secret Service guard who cowered, who hid behind Trump when the shots ran out? And she was the same guard who couldn't holster her weapon. And from pictures it looks like her new assignment is guarding JD Vance. One of the Fargo TV seasons had a line where a character tells a man married to a, I think, fat wife, you can never trust a fat woman because they lack self-control. And the US Secret Service agent who was in charge of security for the Trump rally where Trump got shot, who didn't think it was necessary to have an agent stationed on the roof where crooks shot Donald Trump from, he's still on active duty. My God, I see so many fat security officers, so many fat police and sheriff's deputies, and even Secret Service deputies. I mean, and you're going to tell me that women have to meet the same fitness requirements as men? I've never seen a fat male Secret Service agent, but I sure saw a fat female incompetent Secret Service agent when Donald Trump was shot, and it looks like she's still on duty now. She's guarding JD Vance. So don't law enforcement have any self-respect where they enforce fitness standards? It's not good for one's morale when you see out of shape law enforcement officers. We got new video from the Trump shooting, body cams worn by local law enforcement. Let's just say they don't exactly seem to be the height of fitness. The Dallas Cowboys are coached by an obese coach. I don't think that's a good recipe for instilling esprit de corps. Mike McCarthy, obese coach for the Cowboys. So Israel is successfully picking off Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. And I think this is particularly important because, let's be honest, the average IQ in Gaza is probably in the low 80s. And so the average IQ among Hamas fighters is probably under 90. The average IQ for Hezbollah fighters is probably a maximum of about 90 as an average IQ level. And so the average IQ in Iran is about 83. And so when you've got low IQ populations, they are particularly dependent upon leaders, right? Unlike the German military, which has a high average IQ, right? Germans have a high average IQ, about 102. And so they allowed tremendous freedom for their officers because they were very smart and they were commanding very smart men. But Hezbollah, the Iranian forces, and Hamas are not geniuses, right? And so as you keep picking off their top leadership, you don't replace that overnight. And it's more devastating when you have a low IQ fighting force than when you have a high IQ fighting force who are going to, by definition, be more likely to be resilient and to see the future more clearly and to make better decisions. So I'm struck in all the coverage I'm following on Iran, Hezbollah versus Israel, that Iran and Hezbollah really don't want a wider war. And there's considerable reason to believe that many people in the IDF do want a wider war. Right? So if there's going to be a wider war, it sure looks like Israel is better situated to deal with a wider war than Hezbollah and Iran. And Iran's arsenal is not that impressive, right? it's really old. And so Iran doesn't really have a missile capability or a drone capability to devastate Israel. Now, Hezbollah purportedly has missile capability to devastate Israel. Whether or not that's true, because how competent can these relatively low IQ fighters be? So it wouldn't shock me if Iran and Hezbollah's fighting quality is considerably diminished from how it's portrayed. Right? Iran just does not have the firepower, the technology, the capability to do much damage to Israel. And as for Hezbollah, if Israel launches a ground invasion and drives them north of the Litani River, which is about 7 miles into the Lebanese territory, then most of Hezbollah's missiles are not going to be as much of a threat. So it's interesting watching this war between average to above average IQ power Israel versus its low IQ enemies. So I'm tending towards the estimate that Iran and Hezbollah's fighting quality is overestimated. Right, generally a good idea to bet on IQ as a good approximate for quality, effectiveness, efficiency, and to bet against the low IQ crowd. I just don't think that Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas can replace their leaders so quickly and efficiently. Okay, thinking about Kamala Harris and the pronunciation of her name, and the correct pronunciation of her name is Kama and then La, Kamala. And there's considerable video evidence that Kamala frequently mispronounces her own name. So I think it's a good idea to pronounce people's names correctly. But the stranger the name is, right, the more effort you have to go to. And it's only reasonable to expect people to make that great effort if it's in their self-interest. Also, if you don't take the care to correctly pronounce your own name, why would you expect other people to take the care to pronounce your name correctly? Right? Mispronouncing Kamala's name is just as common among Democrats as it is among Republicans. And it's not as though you add linguistic ability, such as the correct pronunciation of Kamala Harris, at no price, right? It requires effort. And we only have so much power. We only have so much willpower. We only have so much effort in us each day. And so it just takes a little bit away from your resources for the day to enforce the discipline to pronounce difficult names correctly. And sometimes I think, yeah, it's absolutely a good thing to do if it's self-interested. On the other hand, if you want to go with a strange name, then you can't expect people to jump to attention to pronounce it correctly. So, for example, I know many Jewish and Persian Jewish friends who have exotic names, who boil them down for a simple English language name like Buffy, Muffy, completely different from their literal Hebrew or Iranian name. And so I think that's a good strategy. It's like people who are handicapped, right? it's Dennis Prager points this out. It's equally up to you to try to make other people at ease. And if people with difficult names are not interested in putting other people at ease, you can't really expect much from other people to put you at ease by saying your name correctly, unless it's in their interests, such as you are their employer, you are their professor. Then you should be able to rely on self-interest. There was a great article in the New York Times about what happens when you learn a new language. And this is like when you add civil rights, right? You don't just add new wonderful vistas on top of your previous regime. You simultaneously lose something. So when you learn to speak French, you will reduce your ability to pronounce and use English effectively. So with every language that you learn, there's a price paid with other languages. And so when you learn Chaim, all right, the Hebrew CH sound, Chaim, right? That's taking on a new linguistic ability if you're not a native Hebrew speaker. But it may well come at some cost to your pronunciation of English, right? So Americans who go live in France and then they come back to America, right? Their use of English has been transformed and not towards the more effective, right? It becomes more formal and it just sounds off. And it's like diversity, equity, inclusion programs. So this was the top story on the Washington Post I saw this morning about how many diversity, equity, inclusion programs discriminate against white people. Oh, pretty much all of them, because when you emphasize the value of non-white people, when you emphasize the appropriate ways to relate to them, right, you are taking resources and redirecting them, to new groups. And so when you add civil rights for the transgendered, for gays, for women, for blacks, for Jews, right, you take away rights from the majority in its traditional understanding of what matters, right? You've reduced the traditional understanding of the US Constitution, replaced it with a new civil rights constitution. And so you look at all these diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and they're obnoxious, man. You start a job, and often one of the first things you're subjected to is some online virtual test where it forces you to pay attention and to answer questions correctly about what does and does not constitute discrimination and workplace harassment. And I understand why employers do this, right? It reduces their legal liability. But then to go above and beyond simply reducing your legal liability to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and it's understandable why many white people would rise up. And many white people are increasingly suing for racial discrimination because these diversity, equity, inclusion programs, right, they're just part of the hectoring, lecturing, social moral improvement project taken on by a ruling class, trying to distinguish themselves from the masses, finding ever new ways to hector and lecture and seek to improve people, and to secretize some identities, and to, such as black, gay, trans, Chinese, Asian, Muslim, at the same time deny that there's any sort of community for white people. So in the United Kingdom, as David Starkey made clear in his recent online interviews about what's going on in Great Britain, right, every minority community is regarded as sacred and respected by British law enforcement, except for the white community. They don't get a community. So Muslims can march around with machetes and the police won't touch them. Right? There's two-tier policing because you got these sacralized identities such as Muslim, gay, black. And then you've got these common disdained identities such as white. And more and more Americans are fighting back against it. And Stephen Miller and his group are leading the way. Right? They're savvily going after law firms who promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he's suing them for practicing racial discrimination because law firms are about the most risk-averse businesses out there. Right? There are personality changes that occur when one becomes a lawyer, and they tend to make people much more cautious and risk-averse. So if you consult a lawyer, he will, in all likelihood, advise you to practice more caution, more care, and to undertake all sorts of things to reduce your risks that you wouldn't contemplate. So Elliot Blatt, I want you to watch Netflix shows, if you have Netflix, New York Homicide and LA Homicide. They're produced by Dick Wolf, and they go into various murders and the investigations into the murders. And so one thing that struck me in the latest episode was a Jewish businessman who was in the office supply business, and then he added a coffee shop to his office supply store in Manhattan. He was so successful, he added a second coffee store, and under pressure from his wife, right, he hired her brother. And the brother was just a hateful person, was just in constant rebellion against the Jewish boss husband. And then one morning, right, the Jewish boss is just found stabbed to death so many times. After he was already dead, he was already getting stabbed. And so just you watch this series and you think, oh, if I were in this guy's situation, how could I have reduced my chances of getting murdered? And one way you can reduce your chances of getting murdered is to refuse to employ people you don't want to employ. So this guy was openly disrespectful and hateful towards his Jewish employer. And just because he's your wife's brother, you can't give in and hire someone who displays contempt and hatred for you and is not good at his job, right? He wanted a promotion to sales, but he had the anti-sales personality. He wouldn't talk to other people. He would just grunt. Very isolated individual, filled with anger and rage, would obviously have not made a good salesman. And so I often notice that, like wives trying to pressure their husbands into hiring someone. Hell is other people, says Elliot Blatt. I cancelled after Orange is the New Black. Bro, like you have so many reasons, and I'm glad you haven't done this, but you have so many reasons to cancel everybody in your life. Like if you're close to anyone, you recognize that they have many bad qualities. So you can't judge Netflix just by its wokeist programming. There's a lot of good stuff on there. But just watching this series, it makes you think. I don't know, is that how you would watch like a murder investigation series? Do you ever watch the first 48, which is about the first 48 hours after a homicide? And it makes you think, like, what would I do if I were in that situation? The person who got murdered, how would I reduce my chances? So if there's a big life insurance policy, all right, then your spouse is much more incentivized to do you in, which doesn't mean you don't get life insurance, but you just recognize you've got dramatically increased incentive for your spouse to kill you. But you don't want to have employees who create liability, who hate you, who display contempt for you. Like, don't allow anyone to force employees on you or to force their way into your life. And then someone who's having an affair, right, or a series of affairs, like some of the men in these shows, right, they're much more likely to look at their wife as just a millstone around his neck. So men are going to be much more likely to direct their resources towards taking care of the women that they're having sex with, as opposed to their wife. Also, good way to reduce your chances of getting murdered: don't participate in a life of crime. Overwhelmingly, the people who get murdered are people who are engaged in criminal activity such as drugs or gambling. Right? You're engaged in criminal activity, or you're rubbing shoulders with people who make their living in large part from criminal activity. You're dramatically increasing your chances of getting murdered. So no matter how charming or generous or interesting or amusing these criminals are in your life, so it's a bad idea to have them in your life, because you're massively increasing the chances of chaos and disruption and ultimately murder. Right, most people who get murdered are not as hard-working family men. Right, most people who get murdered are not leading law-abiding, upright lives. Right, most people who get murdered are living on the dark side. And so, given the number of psychopaths out there, right, about 3% of the population are defined as psychopaths, you really want to be careful of who you allow into your life. So the one group of people who are hanging out in an illegal marijuana bar, and they all got killed. No, they didn't all get killed. They all got shot. Some survived. But hanging out at an illegal business, right, is a really bad idea. Going home with people you don't know. So thinking about the music producer who took the hostess home in LA, the movie producer, the music producer who did the wall of sound effect, right? And then brings home this woman at 2 or 3 a.m. She just goes home with him. And then as soon as she enters the front door, he had a way of removing any ability to get out that door. So this producer guy, he was famous for just waving around guns. Yeah, extramarital sex is going to radically increase your chances of getting murdered. Yeah, Dr. Todd Grande is very entertaining in his breakdown of crimes. Yeah, First 48, great show. So who was the movie producer who'd wear all these different wigs to court? Music producer. But once you get in a car with someone, once you go home with someone you don't know, right, you lose all sorts of freedom, right? They can just lock all the doors and there's no way out. So I've enjoyed living my life on the wild side at times, right? I blogged about the pornography industry and the mafia for many years. But no sane, self-regarding woman was going to tie her fate with mine while I made that the main focus of my reporting.